I phoned him and asked him to come up to my room in the hotel. Without hesitation, he arrived and opened the door. There I was in a silky satin dress, revealing my curvy body to him. Without hesitation, he came over to me, took off the silky satin dress, threw me onto the bed, and took me in that moment. That night I will never forget. Every inch transformed me, transformed us into something spiritual. My name is Lauren Carter. I'm 34 years old, a graphic designer by trade, and for the last 5 years, a dutiful wife to Mark Carter, a financial analyst whose dedication to his career seems to outshine his commitment to me. We live in a comfortable suburban home just outside of Chicago, the kind of place where lawns are meticulously mowed and neighbors exchange the occasional polite wave but rarely stop to chat. My life is, by most measures, ordinary. But lately, I've felt like I'm slipping into the kind of numbness that can creep into even the happiest of marriages. And that's where my story begins, with the cracks that started showing in my relationship with Mark and the unexpected connection I found in his father, Robert. The Carter family is an enigma, wrapped in politeness and tradition. Mark's parents, Robert and Helen, have been married for 40 years. To the outside world, they are the picture of stability. Robert, a retired professor of English literature, and Helen, a former nurse turned homemaker, seem to have it all together. But at their anniversary celebration a month ago, the tension between them was as palpable as the floral centerpiece on the dining table. It was the kind of discomfort that comes not from fiery arguments, but from years of unresolved resentment. I didn't know then how deeply that tension would entangle me, how it would pull me into a relationship I never expected, with a man who would change how I saw love, loyalty, and myself. It all started on a chilly Saturday in November. Mark and I arrived at his parents' house around noon, bearing a bottle of Cabernet and a strained sense of cheer. Robert greeted us at the door, his smile warm but tired. He hugged me in that way he always did, firm, steady, and lingering, just long enough to feel sincere. Helen appeared moments later, her lipstick impeccably applied, her words clipped and efficient as she ushered us into the living room. It was all very formal. I remember wondering how two people who had been married for so long could feel so distant. Dinner was a quiet affair. Mark chatted about work, Helen nodded along, and Robert sipped his wine, offering the occasional wry observation that hinted at his sharp wit. I noticed how often his eyes drifted toward Helen, as if searching for something that wasn't there. I also noticed how Helen avoided his gaze, her attention fixed on the polished silverware or the untouched salad on her plate. It wasn't until after dinner, when the dishes had been cleared and Mark was deep in conversation with his brother in the den, that I found myself alone with Robert for the first time that evening. He was sitting on the back porch, bundled in a sweater, a glass of whiskey resting on the arm of his chair. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. I stepped outside, wrapping my cardigan tightly around me, and hesitated for a moment before joining him. "Mind if I sit?" I asked. He looked up, his blue eyes softening. Not at all. I sank into the chair beside him, the silence between us strangely comforting. Robert had always struck me as a man who didn't need to fill the quiet with words, and in that moment, I appreciated it. I waited for him to speak first, and when he finally did, his voice was low and steady, tinged with an emotion I couldn't quite place. It's funny, isn't it? How a house can feel so full and so empty at the same time. I glanced at him, unsure how to respond. Are you talking about tonight, or something else? He smiled faintly. A little of both, I suppose. I didn't push him to elaborate, but something in his tone made me wonder if he was talking about more than just the dinner. We sat there for a while, sipping our drinks and watching the stars emerge in the night sky. It was only later, when the others had gone to bed, and I was tidying up in the kitchen, that I overheard the phone call. Helen's voice was low but sharp, her words cutting through the quiet of the house. No, I can't talk now. He's here. Yes, I'll call you tomorrow. A pause, then a hurried, I know. I miss you too. I froze, my hand tightening around the dish towel. My heart raced as I pieced together what I'd just heard. Helen was talking to someone. Someone she missed. Someone who wasn't Robert. My first instinct was to walk away, pretend I hadn't heard anything. But as I lay awake that night beside Mark, his breathing deep and even, I couldn't stop thinking about it. If I told Robert, it could destroy him. If I kept quiet, I'd be complicit in a lie. The next morning, Robert was up early, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee and the crossword puzzle. His expression was calm, almost serene, but there was a heaviness in his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. I debated whether to say anything, but decided against it. Instead, I joined him at the table, pouring myself a cup of coffee and picking up a pen to help with the puzzle. 4 letters, he said, tapping his pencil against the paper. A word for loss of feeling. Numb, I replied without thinking. He looked at me, his gaze lingering a moment too long. Yes, he said quietly. That's the one. It struck me then that Robert wasn't just talking about the crossword. He was talking about his marriage, about the distance between him and Helen, about the quiet ache that comes from loving someone who no longer loves you back. I wanted to tell him that I understood, that I felt the same way sometimes with Mark. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I reached across the table and placed my hand on his. It was a small gesture, one that could easily be dismissed as friendly or comforting. But in that moment, it felt like so much more. It felt like the beginning of something I couldn't yet name. By the time Mark and I left that afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. In me, in Robert, in the delicate balance of our family dynamics. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't the same woman I had been when I walked into that house. And as I watched Robert wave goodbye from the porch, his figure framed by the fading autumn light, I felt an ache in my chest that I couldn't quite explain. Something had begun, though I didn't yet know what. I couldn't get Robert out of my mind. After we left his house that Sunday afternoon, his quiet sadness lingered with me like the scent of autumn leaves that clung to my coat. I told myself it was natural to worry about him. After all, he was my father-in-law, a good man stuck in what seemed to be an impossible situation. But it wasn't just worry. It was something deeper, something I wasn't ready to admit, even to myself. Life at home carried on as usual, which is to say, Mark buried himself in his work, while I tried to find ways to fill the void. Our conversations were short, almost perfunctory, as if we were crossing items off a checklist rather than sharing a life together. He had always been ambitious, but lately it felt like he was more married to his job than to me. I didn't know how to fix it, and part of me was starting to wonder if it was even worth trying. A week after that dinner at the Carter's house, I found myself driving back there, ostensibly to drop off a book Robert had lent me months ago, and I'd never returned. It was an anthology of essays on modern literature, dense, academic, and thoroughly intimidating. But it gave me the excuse I needed to see him again. Robert answered the door in jeans and a sweater, his hair slightly disheveled, as if he'd been lost in thought all morning. He smiled when he saw me, and for the first time in days, I felt a sense of warmth. "Lauren," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "This is a pleasant surprise." "I thought I'd return this," I said, holding up the book. "I figured you might need it back." He took it from me, his fingers brushing mine for just a moment. "I'm glad you came. I didn't really need the book, but I've been wanting to talk to you." There was something in his tone, an undercurrent of urgency, of vulnerability, that caught me off guard. I followed him into the living room, where a fire crackled softly in the hearth. The house felt quieter than usual, almost eerily so. "Where's Helen?" I asked, glancing around. "Out," he said simply, gesturing for me to sit. "Probably shopping, though she doesn't always say where she's going these days." I sat on the edge of the couch, feeling a flicker of guilt for my relief that we were alone. Robert settled into the armchair across from me, the book resting on his lap. For a moment, We just sat there, the silence stretching between us like a fragile thread. "Lauren," he began, his voice low, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." "Of course, I said, my heart beginning to race. He hesitated, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "Do you think Helen is seeing someone else?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The memory of Helen's phone call replayed in my mind, her hushed tone, her careful choice of words. I felt a rush of emotions, guilt, anger, and a strange sense of protectiveness for Robert. I don't know for sure," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why do you ask?" He let out a long sigh, leaning back in his chair. "It's just a feeling I've had for a while now. She's distant, distracted. There are phone calls she doesn't want me to hear, and she's always finding reasons to leave the house. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, but deep down, I think I've known for a long time." My chest tightened at the sadness in his voice. He looked so lost, so defeated, and I hated Helen in that moment for what she had done to him. "I'm so sorry, Robert," I said. I wish I knew what to say. He gave me a small, rueful smile. "It's not your burden to carry, Lauren. I needed to say it out loud to someone. Keeping it to myself has been eating me alive." I nodded, understanding all too well the weight of unspoken truths. "Have you confronted her about it?" He shook his head. "What would be the point? If I'm right, she won't admit it. And if I'm wrong, well..." He trailed off, his gaze drifting to the fire. 40 years of marriage, and this is where we've ended up. It feels like such a waste." "It's not a waste," I said quickly. "You've built a life together, raised a family. That matters, even if things aren't perfect now." He looked at me then, his eyes soft but searching. "You're kind to say that, Lauren, but sometimes I wonder if we've just been going through the motions for years, too afraid to admit that we stopped loving each other a long time ago." His words struck a chord in me, echoing thoughts I hadn't dared to articulate about my own marriage. Mark and I weren't fighting or miserable, but we weren't happy either. We existed in the same space without really connecting, like two strangers who happened to share a house. "I think a lot of people feel that way," I said carefully, "but it doesn't mean you can't find a way back to each other." "Maybe," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "But sometimes I wonder if it's too late." We sat in silence for a while after that, the fire crackling softly in the background. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him that everything would be okay, but I knew it wasn't my place. Instead, I reached across the coffee table and placed my hand over his. It was a small gesture, one that felt both innocent and deeply intimate. He looked down at our hands, then back up at me, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Lauren," he said softly, "for listening, for being here." "Anytime," I said, and I meant it. When I left that afternoon, I felt a strange mix of emotions. I was grateful for the connection we'd shared, but I was also deeply unsettled. Robert's pain had awakened something in me, an ache I didn't fully understand, a longing for something I couldn't quite name. As I drove home, I couldn't help but wonder where this path would lead us. And for the first time in a long time, I felt both terrified and alive. The next few weeks passed in a blur of routine, yet something felt irrevocably altered. I thought about Robert constantly, not in a romantic sense, not yet, but in a way that felt electric and unnerving. He lingered in my mind like the refrain of a half-forgotten song, his sadness and quiet resilience calling out to a part of me I hadn't realized was so starved for connection. Mark remained as busy as ever, his long hours at the office leaving me to my own devices most evenings. I filled the time with work, with errands, and with half-hearted attempts to reignite my passion for painting, but nothing could quiet the restlessness that had taken root inside me. I knew I should let the memory of that afternoon with Robert fade into the background, but instead, I found myself longing for another chance to talk to him. That chance came sooner than I expected. On a cold, gray Thursday morning, Robert called me, his voice hesitant and warm. "Lauren," he said, "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all," I replied, trying to sound casual despite the flutter in my chest. "What's up?" "I was wondering if you'd like to join me for a walk this afternoon," he said. "There's a trail near the house I haven't been to in years. I thought it might be nice to have some company." I hesitated for a fraction of a second, my mind racing with reasons to say no, because it felt like crossing a line, because I didn't want to complicate things further. But none of those reasons outweighed the pull I felt toward him. "I'd love to," I said finally. "What time?" "Come by around 2, he said. "And dress warmly. It's colder out than it looks." When I arrived at the Carter's house that afternoon, Robert was waiting for me on the porch, bundled in a heavy coat and a scarf. He smiled when he saw me, and the warmth of it cut through the chilly December air. "Ready to brave the cold?" he asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," I said, returning his smile. We set off down the street, the sound of our footsteps crunching against the frosty pavement. The trail Robert had mentioned was tucked away behind a small park, winding through a stretch of woods that felt miles away from the suburban sprawl. The trees were bare, their skeletal branches reaching toward a sky the color of slate, but the quiet beauty of the place was undeniable. For a while we walked in silence, the rhythm of our steps creating a soothing backdrop. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, though. It felt natural, almost companionable. I found myself stealing glances at Robert, noting the way his breath puffed out in little clouds, the way his eyes softened when he took in the landscape around us. "This was always one of my favorite spots," he said after a while. "Helen and I used to bring the boys here when they were little. Mark loved it. He'd run ahead on the trail, always looking for the next adventure." I smiled at the thought of a younger Mark, full of energy and curiosity. "It's hard to picture him like that," I said. "He's so serious now, so focused." Robert chuckled softly. "He gets that from Helen, I think. She's always been the practical one, the planner. I was the dreamer, the one who taught the boys to look up at the stars and wonder what it all meant." The wistfulness in his voice tugged at my heart. "I think you're still that person," I said. "The dreamer. It's one of the things I've always admired about you." He glanced at me, surprised. "You think so?" "I do," I said firmly. "You see the world in a way that most people don't. It's a gift." He didn't respond right away, but the faint smile that played at the corners of his mouth told me my words had landed where they needed to. We reached a clearing in the woods where a wooden bench overlooked a frozen pond. Robert gestured for me to sit, and we settled onto the bench, the cold seeping through our coats as we gazed out at the water, the quiet of the woods wrapped around us like a blanket, and for a moment, it felt as if the rest of the world had fallen away. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation," Robert said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "About what you said, that it's not too late to find a way back to each other." I turned to look at him, my breath catching in my throat. "And what do you think?" I asked. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the pond. "I think it's easier said than done. I've tried, Lauren. I've tried to be patient, to give Helen the space she seems to need. But the truth is, I don't know if she wants to come back. I don't even know if she cares anymore." The raw vulnerability in his words cut through me like a knife. I wanted to tell him that he deserved better, that he deserved someone who saw him for the kind, thoughtful man he was. But I knew that wasn't what he needed to hear. Not yet. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "I wish I had the right words, but I don't. I hate that you're going through this." He turned to me then, his eyes searching mine. "You have no idea how much it means to me that you care, Lauren. You've been a lifeline for me these past few weeks, even if you didn't realize it." The intensity of his gaze made my pulse quicken, but I forced myself to stay grounded. "You don't have to go through this alone," I said. "I'm here. Always." He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me, a spark I couldn't ignore. I saw the conflict in his eyes, the same conflict that was swirling inside me, and for a moment, the line between us felt dangerously thin. But then he pulled his hand back, his expression shifting to something more guarded. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but distant. "That means a lot." The moment passed, leaving a strange ache in its wake. We sat there for a while longer, talking about lighter things, the books we were reading, the places we wanted to visit someday. But the memory of that fleeting touch lingered, a reminder of the connection we were both trying so hard to deny. When we finally headed back to the house, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting the woods in a soft, golden light. Robert walked me to my car, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. "Thank you for today," he said as I opened the car door. "It was good to talk, to get out of my own head for a while." "Anytime," I said, and I meant it. "Take care of yourself, okay?" He nodded. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something just as powerful. My heart skipped beats when I thought of him, how his touch might be, how he would be with me and what he would do to me. And I wasn't sure either of us was ready for where it might lead. Not yet, anyway. I couldn't stop replaying that afternoon with Robert in my mind. The way he'd looked at me, the way his hand had lingered on mine for just a moment before he pulled away. It was like a spark had ignited something buried deep within me. But as much as I felt drawn to him, I knew we were treading on dangerous ground. I told myself it was just a fleeting moment of connection between two people who were lonely and lost. But the truth, the one I couldn't yet admit, was that I wanted to feel that connection again. Mark noticed none of this, of course. He was too wrapped up in his work to see the shift in me, or the growing distance between us. I tried to broach the subject a few times, suggesting we spend more time together, maybe plan a weekend away. But he always had an excuse. "Next week," he'd say, or "Let's talk about it after this project is done." The weeks turned into months, and I started to feel like I was living with a stranger. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, my phone buzzed with a message from Helen. "Hi, Lauren. Any chance you could swing by tomorrow? I'd love to catch up." I stared at the screen, surprised. Helen and I had never been particularly close. She was polite, even warm at times, but there was always a certain reserve in her demeanor, a coolness that kept people at arm's length. For her to reach out like this was unusual, and I couldn't help but wonder what she wanted. The next afternoon, I found myself back at the Carter's house. Helen greeted me at the door, her makeup flawless as always, her smile as poised as ever. She ushered me into the living room, where a pot of tea and a plate of cookies waited on the coffee table. "Thanks for coming," she said, settling into her usual chair. "It's been a while since we've had a proper chat." I nodded, feeling a flicker of unease. There was something in her tone that I couldn't quite place. "Of course," I said, taking a seat on the couch. "Is everything okay?" She hesitated, pouring herself a cup of tea before answering. "Oh, you know how it is. Life gets complicated as the years go by." She paused, her eyes scanning my face. "How are things with you and Mark?" The question caught me off guard. "They're fine," I said, though the word felt hollow as it left my mouth. "Why do you ask?" She gave a small shrug, her smile tight. "I just worry about him sometimes. He's so much like his father, you know. Always focused on work, always carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. It's easy for a man like that to neglect what really matters." I felt a pang of defensiveness rise in me, though I wasn't sure if it was for Mark or Robert. "He's been busy," I said, "but we're working on it." Helen nodded, her expression unreadable. "That's good to hear. Marriage is hard work, Lauren. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Something about the way she said it made my stomach twist. It wasn't just her words. It was the way her gaze shifted, the faint edge in her voice. It was almost as if she were trying to convince herself. Before I could respond, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She glanced at the screen, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Excuse me for a moment," she said, rising from her chair and stepping into the hallway. I sat there, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Helen's phone was still on the coffee table, its screen lighting up with a new message. I glanced at it, more out of reflex than curiosity, but what I saw made my breath catch. "Looking forward to seeing you tonight? Same place?" R. My mind raced, piecing together the implications of the message. Helen wasn't just distant. She was involved with someone else. Someone she was planning to meet that very night. Yeah, I heard her footsteps returning and quickly looked away, my heart pounding. She re-entered the room, her smile perfectly composed, as if nothing had happened. "Sorry about that," she said, reclaiming her seat. "Where were we?" That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. The message was clear, the evidence undeniable. Helen was having an affair. The question was, what was I supposed to do about it? I wanted to tell Robert. He deserved to know the truth, didn't he? But the thought of hurting him, of being the one to shatter whatever illusions he still clung to, made my stomach turn. And then there was the matter of Mark. How would he react if he found out about his mother's betrayal? Or worse, if he found out I'd known and said nothing. I stayed up late, pacing the living room and weighing my options. By the time I finally crawled into bed, I still hadn't made a decision. But the thought of Robert sitting alone in that big, empty house broke something in me. The next morning, I called Robert. "Are you free this afternoon?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Of course," he said, his tone tinged with concern. "Is everything all right?" "Yeah," I lied. "I just thought we could take another walk." When I arrived at the house, Robert greeted me with his usual warmth, though I could see the question in his eyes. We set off down the same trail as before, the silence between us more charged this time. "I need to tell you something," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Something about Helen." He stopped walking, turning to face me. "What is it?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. But the look in his eyes, so full of quiet pain, spurred me on. "I think she's seeing someone else," I said. "I saw a message on her phone yesterday. She's meeting someone." For a moment, Robert said nothing. His expression didn't change, but I saw the way his shoulders sagged, the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I suspected as much," he said finally, his voice quiet. But hearing it confirmed. He trailed off, looking away. "I'm so sorry," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "I didn't want to hurt you, but I thought you deserved to know." He nodded, his gaze distant. "Thank you for telling me, Lauren. At least now I know I'm not imagining things." We continued walking, the weight of the revelation hanging heavy between us. For the first time, I saw the depth of Robert's pain, the cracks in his stoic exterior. And as much as I wanted to comfort him, I knew there were no words that could make this better. All I could do was walk beside him, sharing the quiet solitude of the trail, and hope that somehow we would both find a way through the heartbreak. The days following my conversation with Robert felt heavy, as though the truth I'd shared with him had settled into my bones. I kept thinking about him, wondering how he was coping with the weight of what he now knew. Though we hadn't spoken again since that walk, I felt tethered to him in ways I couldn't explain or justify. Mark, meanwhile, was as oblivious as ever. He came home late most nights, consumed by his work, barely noticing my quiet mood. Then, on Thursday evening, he surprised me. "I booked us a weekend away," he announced over dinner. His tone was casual, as though he were suggesting picking up milk from the store. I blinked at him, caught off guard. "You did what?" "A weekend away," he repeated. "At that hotel downtown, the one you've always liked. Figured we could use some time for ourselves, just to reset, you know?" My heart twisted at his words, the gesture so out of character for him that I didn't know how to respond. For months, I'd been craving his attention, his effort, and now here it was, offered almost as an afterthought. I should have felt happy, but instead I felt hollow. Why now? Why when my thoughts were already tangled up in someone else? Still, I nodded, forcing a smile. That sounds nice. Saturday afternoon, we drove into the city, our bags packed for a weekend of supposed reconnection. The hotel was a modern oasis, all sleek lines and understated luxury, perched on the edge of the Chicago River. I had always admired it from a distance, its glass facade glittering in the sunlight. And Mark had been right. I had mentioned wanting to stay there once, a long time ago. The lobby was stunning, with high ceilings and a massive chandelier that sparkled like a galaxy of stars. Mark checked us in while I wandered over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the bustling city below. Something about the view, the busy streets, the people hurrying about their lives, made me feel even more disconnected from my own. "Ready to head up?" Mark asked, coming to stand beside me. He held up a key card, his smile boyish and proud, as though he'd just pulled off a grand surprise. "Sure," I said, following him to the elevator. Our room was beautiful, sleek, spacious, with a king-sized bed that looked like a cloud. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the river and the glittering skyline beyond. Mark immediately began unpacking, laying out his things with his usual efficiency, while I wandered over to the window, my fingers brushing the cold glass. "It's beautiful," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Mark came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "I thought you'd like it," he said, resting his chin on my shoulder. "It's been a while since we did something like this." I leaned into his embrace, trying to let myself enjoy the moment. But even as I stood there, looking out at the breathtaking view, my thoughts drifted to Robert. Was he at home, sitting alone in his quiet house? Was Helen out meeting her lover? The questions gnawed at me, pulling me further away from the present. Mark didn't seem to notice my distraction. "What do you say we head down to the spa before dinner?" he suggested, his voice light. "Get massages, relax a little." "That sounds nice," I said, forcing another smile. The spa was luxurious, with soft lighting and the soothing scent of eucalyptus in the air. I let myself sink into the experience, letting the massage therapist work out the knots in my back and shoulders. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of peace, as though I could push everything else aside and just exist in the present. Dinner that evening was at the hotel's upscale restaurant, a place that oozed elegance and sophistication. We sat by the window, candles flickering on the table between us, the sound of soft jazz floating in the background. Mark ordered a bottle of wine, his enthusiasm for the evening palpable. "This is nice," he said, raising his glass. "We should do things like this more often." I clinked my glass against his, nodding. We should. But even as I said the words, I felt the chasm between us. Mark talked about work, about his plans for the next quarter, about a new client he'd landed. I listened, nodding at the right moments, but my mind kept wandering. When had we become this? Two people sitting across from each other, talking about nothing of substance. I tried to think of the last time he'd asked me about my life, my feelings, but I came up empty. "What about you?" he asked suddenly, breaking into my thoughts. "You've been quiet lately. Everything okay?" The question caught me off guard. "Yeah," I said quickly. "Just a lot on my mind." He frowned, his brow furrowing in concern. "Work stress?" "Something like that," I said, taking a sip of my wine to avoid his gaze. I wanted to tell him the truth, to say that I felt lonely, disconnected, that I didn't know how to bridge the gap between us. But the words stuck in my throat. Mark reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "I know I've been busy," he said, "but I'm trying, Lauren. I really am." "I know," I said, my voice soft. "Thank you for this. It means a lot." And it did. At least, I wanted it to. But as I sat there staring at the man I'd married, I couldn't ignore the gnawing ache in my chest. This was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to reconnect. But all I felt was the growing weight of everything we weren't saying. That night, back in our room, Mark fell asleep almost as soon as his head hit the pillow. I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, the city lights casting faint shadows on the walls. I thought about the boy I'd fallen in love with years ago, the boy who had been so full of life and ambition. He was still there, somewhere, but he felt like a stranger now. I turned onto my side, watching the rise and fall of Mark's chest as he slept. I wanted to reach out to him, to shake him awake and tell him everything. How lonely I'd felt. How I didn't know if I could keep pretending we were okay. But instead, I stayed silent, the words dissolving on my tongue. As the hours ticked by, I thought about Robert again. I thought about the sadness in his eyes, the quiet strength in his voice, the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. And for the first time, I let myself wonder what it would mean to let that connection grow, to step fully into the space between us. It was a dangerous thought, one I couldn't afford to entertain. But as I lay there in the dark, listening to the city hum outside the window, I knew that part of me had already crossed the line. My hands moved to the thought of him, what he could do to me. I had to explore. I had to. The weekend with Mark left me feeling more adrift than ever. On the surface, everything had been perfect. The luxurious hotel, the candlelit dinners, the spa treatments. But beneath it all was the unmistakable emptiness that had come to define our relationship. Mark seemed content to skim the surface, to accept the facade, while I felt like I was drowning. When Robert called me the following Tuesday, his voice hesitant yet warm, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. He didn't need to say much, just hearing him was enough to steady me. "Lauren," he said, "I know it's short notice, but would you like to meet for coffee? There's something I'd like to talk about." I hesitated for only a moment. "Of course," I said. "Where should we meet?" We met at a small cafe tucked away on a quiet street, a place Robert said he'd discovered years ago. The atmosphere was cozy, with warm wood tones and the faint scent of fresh pastries in the air. He was already waiting for me when I arrived, a steaming mug of coffee in front of him. His eyes lit up when he saw me, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name, a mixture of comfort and longing. "Thanks for coming," he said as I slid into the chair across from him. "Of course," I replied. "Is everything okay?" He paused, his fingers tracing the rim of his mug. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said finally. "About everything. About Helen. About you." My breath caught at the way he said that last word, so softly it was almost a whisper. "I'm sorry if I've burdened you," he continued, his gaze fixed on the table. "You've been so kind to me, Lauren. More than I deserve. I needed to see you." His vulnerability unraveled something inside me. "You're not a burden, Robert," I said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "You're important to me. I don't want you to feel like you're going through this alone." He looked up then, his eyes meeting mine, and in that moment, the air between us shifted. There was something unspoken but undeniable, a current pulling us toward each other. "Come with me," he said suddenly, his voice low and steady. "There's somewhere I want to take you." I didn't ask where we were going, and he didn't volunteer the information. We walked in silence to his car, the quiet tension between us heavy, but not uncomfortable. He drove with his eyes fixed on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I stared out the window, my heart racing as the city blurred past. When he pulled into the parking lot of a boutique hotel, my pulse quickened. The building was elegant, understated, its entrance framed by twinkling lights. Robert parked the car and turned to me, his expression unreadable. "We don't have to go inside," he said softly. "But I wanted to be somewhere away from everything. Somewhere we could talk, just the two of us." I should have said no. I should have told him this was too much, too far. But instead, I nodded, my chest tightening with anticipation. The room was beautiful. its minimalist design softened by warm lighting and plush furnishings. A large window overlooked the city, the skyline glittering like 1,000 tiny stars. I stood by the window, my arms crossed over my chest, while Robert set his keys on the table and loosened the scarf around his neck. "Lauren," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "if this is too much, please tell me. I don't want to make you uncomfortable." I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "I'm not uncomfortable," I said. I don't know what this is." He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were afraid I might vanish. "Neither do I," he admitted. "All I know is that when I'm with you, I feel alive. Like I'm not just going through the motions anymore." His words hit me like a tidal wave, crashing over everything I'd been trying to suppress. I thought about Mark, about the empty spaces between us, and about the way Robert made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. I closed the distance between us before I could think better of it, my hand resting on his chest. I could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my palm and the warmth of his skin through his shirt. He looked down at me, his eyes searching mine, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. "Could you give me a minute, please?" I asked him softly. "Sure, I will wait in the lobby to give you time," he politely replied. He left the room. Was I doing the right thing? It just felt right. In that moment. After about 10 minutes, I put on my favorite silky satin dress I packed with me, enhancing my curves. I phoned him and asked him to come up to my room in the hotel. Without hesitation, he arrived and opened the door. There I was in a silky satin dress, revealing my curvy body to him. Without hesitation, he came over to me, took off the silky satin dress, threw me onto the bed, and took me in that moment. That night was I will never forget. Every inch transformed me, transformed us into something spiritual. When he kissed me, it was gentle at first, almost tentative, as if he were testing the waters. But when I didn't pull away, when I kissed him back, the floodgates opened. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and my fingers tangled in his hair, holding him to me as though letting go would break the spell. We moved together as if drawn by some invisible force, the world outside the hotel room fading into nothingness. His lips traveled from my mouth to my jawline, then to the sensitive spot just below my ear, and I felt a shiver run through me. It was the kind of intimacy I hadn't realized I'd been craving, the kind that left no room for doubt or hesitation. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low and rough, his forehead resting against mine. "Yes," I whispered, my answer as much for myself as it was for him. The hours that followed were a blur of heat and softness, of whispered words and unspoken promises. Robert's touch was reverent, as if he were memorizing every inch of me, and I let myself sink into the moment, leaving my guilt and uncertainty at the door. Afterward, we lay tangled together on the bed, the city lights casting faint patterns on the ceiling. Robert's arm was draped over me, his fingers tracing lazy circles on my shoulder. Neither of us spoke, but the silence was filled with an intimacy that words couldn't capture. I knew the world outside would come rushing back eventually. I knew there would be consequences, questions, and choices I wasn't ready to face. But for now, in the quiet cocoon of that hotel room, none of it mattered. All that mattered was him, and the connection we'd found in the unlikeliest of places. "I don't know what happens next," he murmured, his voice heavy with exhaustion and emotion. "Neither do I said, my fingers brushing against his. "But we'll figure it out. Together." The next morning, the soft glow of sunlight spilled through the sheer curtains, casting golden light across the hotel room. I woke up nestled against Robert, his arm still draped over me. For a moment, I allowed myself to revel in the warmth of his presence, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the quiet intimacy of simply being beside him. But as the haze of the night began to clear, reality came crashing in. The weight of what we had done pressed down on me like a tidal wave, suffocating and unrelenting. My thoughts raced, each one more chaotic than the last. What would Mark think if he found out? What would this mean for Robert's already fragile relationship with Helen? And what did it mean for me? For us? Robert stirred beside me, his hand moving absently across my back before he opened his eyes. When he looked at me, his gaze was soft, filled with a tenderness that both comforted and unsettled me. "Morning," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my voice quieter, more hesitant. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was different now, heavier, filled with unspoken fears and unanswered questions. "Are you okay?" he asked finally, propping himself up on one elbow to look at me more closely. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure it was true. "I'm just trying to make sense of everything." His expression darkened, and he reached for my hand, lacing his fingers with mine. "Lauren, if you regret this, if I've put you in a position you didn't want to be in—" "No," I interrupted, shaking my head. "I don't regret it. I don't know what comes next." He exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging. "Neither do I. But I know this. What happened last night wasn't a mistake. It might be complicated. It might be messy. But it wasn't a mistake." His words settled something inside me, soothing the storm of doubt that had been swirling in my chest. I nodded, squeezing his hand. "I feel the same way." We stayed like that for a while, the morning stretching out around us, until the world outside the hotel room began to creep back in. Robert's phone buzzed from the nightstand, its screen lighting up with a name I recognized all too well: Helen. His jaw tightened as he reached for the phone, silencing the call without answering. He set it back down, his shoulders slumping as he ran a hand through his hair. "She's probably wondering where I am," he said, his tone tinged with bitterness. "Are you going to tell her?" I asked, my voice cautious. He shook his head. "There's nothing to tell. Whatever we had, whatever she feels for whoever she's seeing now, it's over. I've known that for a while." I wanted to ask him what he planned to do next, but the words felt too heavy, too invasive. Instead, I slipped out of bed and began gathering my clothes, the practicalities of the morning pulling me back to reality. The drive home was quiet, the air between us filled with an unspoken understanding. Robert offered to drop me off at a nearby coffee shop so I could call a rideshare, an extra layer of discretion that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. Before I got out of the car, he turned to me, his hand lingering on the gear shift. "Lauren," he said, his voice low, "whatever happens next, you mean something to me. You need to know that." I nodded, unable to trust myself to speak. My throat felt tight, my emotions teetering on the edge of spilling over. "You mean something to me too," I managed, my voice barely a whisper. He reached for my hand, squeezing it briefly before letting go. I climbed out of the car, watching as he drove away, the taillights fading into the distance. When I got home, Mark was sitting at the kitchen table, his laptop open in front of him. He looked up when I walked in, a faint frown creasing his forehead. "Where have you been?" he asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. "Ran a few errands," I lied, slipping off my coat and hanging it on the hook by the door. "Thought I'd take advantage of the morning." He nodded, his attention already drifting back to his screen. "I was thinking we could go out for dinner tonight," he said. "You know, make up for the craziness at work lately." "Sure," I said, forcing a smile. "That sounds nice." Inside, I felt like a stranger in my own home. The weight of what had happened with Robert hung over me like a cloud, casting everything in a different light. Mark's obliviousness only made it worse. How could he not see the distance between us, the cracks that had been widening for months, maybe even years? Over the next few days, I tried to carry on as though nothing had changed. But every time my phone buzzed, my heart leapt, hoping and dreading that it might be Robert. When I finally heard from him, it was a text, short and simple, but enough to send my emotions into a tailspin. I can't stop thinking about you. Can we talk? I stared at the message, my fingers hovering over the screen as I debated what to say. I wanted to see him, to feel the comfort of his presence, but I also knew that every step we took down this path would make it harder to turn back. After a long moment, I typed out a response. Yes, when? We met that evening in a quiet park on the edge of town, the fading light casting long shadows across the grass. Robert was waiting for me near a bench, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat. He looked up when he saw me, his expression a mixture of relief and uncertainty. I'm glad you came, he said as I approached. I wasn't sure I should, I admitted, stopping a few feet away from him. He nodded, his gaze steady. I know, but I needed to see you. We sat on the bench, the silence between us heavy, but not uncomfortable. Finally, Robert turned to me, his expression serious. I don't know where this is going, Lauren, he said. I don't even know if we should be doing this, but I can't pretend I don't feel something for you, something I haven't felt in a long time. I looked down at my hands, my heart pounding. I feel it too, I said softly. But it scares me. There's so much at stake. I know, he said, his voice quiet but firm. But I also know that what we have, whatever it is real. And I don't want to let it go without knowing what it could be. His words hung in the air, a challenge and a promise all at once. I felt the weight of them, the gravity of what we were stepping into. But as I looked into his eyes, I knew I couldn't walk away, not yet. Not when everything inside me was telling me to stay. The park felt like it existed in a world apart from reality, suspended in twilight as Robert and I sat side by side. His words echoed in my mind, raw, honest, and heavy with the kind of emotion I hadn't felt from anyone in so long. I didn't respond right away. I didn't trust myself to. The feelings swirling inside me were as intoxicating as they were terrifying. When I finally spoke, my voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know how to do this, Robert. I don't know how to be the person who complicates things. He turned to me, his gaze steady and full of an intensity that almost made me look away. You're not the one complicating anything, he said firmly. Things were already broken, between me and Helen, between you and Mark. We didn't cause that. We're just finding each other in the aftermath. His words settled over me, both a comfort and a weight. I wanted so badly to believe him, to believe that what was happening between us wasn't wrong, but something inevitable, something natural. But no matter how much I felt drawn to him, the reality of our situation loomed large in the back of my mind. I don't know how we keep this from falling apart, I admitted, my hands twisting in my lap. What if it all comes crashing down? He reached over, gently placing his hand over mine. Maybe it will, he said quietly. But I'd rather face that than go back to pretending I don't feel anything. Wouldn't you? His question cut through all my doubts, all my fears. Because he was right. No matter how dangerous, how reckless this was, the thought of going back to the numbness I'd been living in was unbearable. I met his gaze, my heart pounding as I nodded. Yes, I said, my voice trembling but resolute. I would. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope, each step more precarious than the last. Mark remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface, his focus still consumed by work. We had dinner together, went through the motions of our shared routines, but every moment I spent with him felt like a performance, a carefully constructed facade. I hated the dishonesty of it, but I didn't know how to stop. Robert and I began meeting more often, always careful, always discreet. Coffee shops, quiet parks, even the occasional drive to nowhere, where we could sit and talk without fear of being seen. Each meeting felt like stolen time, a precious escape from the confines of our lives. But as the weeks went on, the boundaries we had tried to maintain began to blur. The simple act of talking, of being near each other, wasn't enough anymore. The pull between us grew stronger, more urgent, until it was impossible to ignore. One evening, Robert called me, his voice low and strained. "Lauren," he said, "I can't stop thinking about you, about us." I closed my eyes, leaning against the kitchen counter as my heart raced. "I can't stop thinking about you either," I admitted. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the silence heavy with meaning. "I want to see you," he said finally. "Really see you. Somewhere we don't have to keep looking over our shoulders." I knew what he meant, and despite the rush of fear and guilt that swept through me, I didn't hesitate. "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The hotel Robert chose was just outside the city, a quiet, upscale place tucked away from prying eyes. I arrived first, my nerves buzzing as I stepped into the softly lit lobby. Everything about the place exuded calm, the muted tones of the decor, the faint scent of lavender in the air. But I felt anything but calm. My heart was racing, my mind spinning with what we were about to do. When Robert walked in, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. He looked as nervous as I felt, but when his eyes met mine, there was a quiet determination in his gaze that steadied me. We didn't say much as we made our way to the room, the weight of what we were about to do hanging between us. But when the door closed behind us, sealing us off from the outside world, everything else seemed to fall away. Robert reached for me, his hands trembling slightly as they cupped my face. "Lauren," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "are you sure? I need to know this is what you want." I nodded, tears springing to my eyes as I placed my hands over his. "I've never been more sure of anything," I said. The first kiss was slow, almost hesitant, as though we were testing the waters. But as his lips moved against mine, as his hands slid to my waist, the hesitation melted away. The dam broke, and the flood of emotion we'd been holding back for so long came rushing out. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word felt like a revelation, like rediscovering something I hadn't realized I'd lost. Robert's touch wasn't just physical. It was grounding, affirming, reminding me that I was still capable of feeling, of wanting, of being wanted. Afterward, we lay tangled together in the soft sheets. Robert's arm was draped over me, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my shoulder. Neither of us spoke for a long time, the silence filled with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. "Do you regret it?" he asked finally, his voice soft but laced with uncertainty. I turned to look at him, my heart aching at the vulnerability in his eyes. "No," I said, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from his forehead. "I don't regret it. Not for a second." He exhaled, his tension easing as he pulled me closer. "Neither do I," he said, "but I don't know where we go from here." I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I don't either," I admitted, "but I know I don't want this to be the end." His arms tightened around me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something beautiful, no matter how complicated. The days following that night with Robert felt like stepping into a new reality, one where the line between right and wrong blurred under the weight of our emotions. I told myself it wasn't just physical. It never had been. What we'd shared was something deeper, something born of vulnerability and mutual understanding. But as beautiful as it felt, the truth of our circumstances loomed over us like a storm cloud. Mark noticed the shift in me, though he didn't press. He asked me once if everything was okay, his brow furrowing in rare concern. I told him I was fine, but the words felt hollow, a placeholder for all the things I couldn't say. The guilt gnawed at me in quiet moments, but it wasn't enough to pull me away from Robert. Not yet. Robert, too, was struggling. He told me